Okay, welcome to everybody that has joined us for our Wednesday Bible class. And we are, surprisingly, to the end, the very, very end, the last chapter of the book of Jeremiah. I've probably said this before. There is something about this pandemic over the last 6 months. Time has just been very strange. I feel I'm sure you feel the same way, that the passing of time has not felt normal. Passing of time is always strange, so maybe this isn't that abnormal. And maybe having a baby at home is likewise throwing time into a weird sort of dynamic for us. But yeah, in some senses, it feels like we were just making the decision to go to virtual services and classes, and we were just getting into the book of Jeremiah. And here we are basically 6 months later to the last chapter of the book of Jeremiah, to chapter 52. And what a journey it's been. At least I hope it has been a profitable journey for us. So we are just a few weeks away, really just a couple weeks away from the beginning of our new quarter. And remember, if you have not heard or seen this, we are going back to in-person assemblies. Starting a week from Sunday on the 23rd, we will meet for our worship services in person, and this adult class will take place in person in the auditorium afterward, but that is the only activity that will take place on the 23rd and the 30th. But September, the 6th or 7th of September, whatever that date is, the first Sunday in September, we'll be back to, the plan is right now, to be back to normal operations, including worship services and all Sunday Bible classes, still virtual though on Wednesday nights. But September is a fitting time for us to get back to those procedures, because September is, as it is every year, the beginning of our new quarter. And so that means this class is going to end at the end of August. That's what I was getting to in saying all of that, which means we just have, after tonight, 6 more class periods. And so you may be wondering what the plan is, since this is the last chapter of Jeremiah. What I hope to accomplish, and you can be preparing for this in your own personal reading and effort, what I hope to do is, over the next 6 class periods, to do 2 things. One is to provide some sort of reflection, review on the book of Jeremiah. We've looked at the whole thing. What do we make of it? What do we make of it for our own lives? Maybe, to some extent, go back through and review some of the things that we've talked about over the course of this class. And then, once we've done that, probably just in 1 class period more, we will spend the rest of our time looking at the book of Lamentations. We'll talk some about what Lamentations is and what it's all about. It is historically tied to the book of Jeremiah. It comes after Jeremiah, as you see in your Bibles. But Lamentations is kind of a natural book to talk about at the end of a class on Jeremiah, and so we will spend some time in that book as well. And then, as we said, September will start a new quarter of classes. And on Sundays, Steve will be teaching a class for us, an adult class for us. And then we will do something different, another class that I'll be teaching on Wednesdays virtually, starting again in September. Okay, so the last chapter of Jeremiah chapter 52. If this chart is burned into your memory, which it might be, I don't know, I've basically shown it to you every class for the last 6 months, you may think, Jeremiah 52, I didn't even know there was a Jeremiah 52, because this chart that I've shown you over and over again doesn't have Jeremiah 52 on it. And that's because Jeremiah 52 serves as somewhat of an epilogue, meaning that you can see, and we've tried to make this case, that there is somewhat of a structure to the book of Jeremiah, a symmetrical structure. And when you draw that out, the section ending in chapter 51 is kind of like the end, in that it ties back to the first section of the book. And as we'll see, as I'll mention in a second, the end of chapter 51 kind of said that it was the end of the book. And yet, here we are. There is still 1 more chapter left, and so we'll call it an epilogue of sorts. And I don't know how you are when you read a book. For me, it depends, I think, on the book I'm reading and how long the epilogue is, probably. If you're a Harry Potter fan, you probably were, chomping at the bit to read the epilogue of Harry Potter in the 7th book, because, they're adults, they're grown up. You want to get a taste of what that's like. That's very exciting. Some books, though, you get to the end of the last chapter, you think, the epilogue, who cares, right? It can't be anything that worthwhile in it. Hopefully we'll see some things worthwhile in Jeremiah 52 tonight. But because we are coming to the end of Jeremiah, I think it is going to be helpful to do a little bit of a review of the history and some of the main themes. I've scaled this down from what we would typically do in a review. Try to save some time for not only the study of Jeremiah 52, but also some things I want to say at the end from the New Testament. But let's go through this quickly. The historical context of Jeremiah really is that this is the end. This is the end of a kind of era of Israelite and the history of the Jews and Judah. They're not really termed the Jews till later on, but we've seen that language in the book of Jeremiah. But the history of Israel, at least in terms of as a kingdom, a nation ruled by kings, this is what it looks like. They are united during the days of Saul, David, and Solomon, all 12 tribes, north and south, and especially in the time of David and Solomon, are fairly powerful, strong, wealthy, unified, so on and so forth. But there is a split in the days of Solomon's son, Rehoboam, and that's when we get what we call the divided kingdom. Israel in the north, made up of the 10 tribes that are, for the most part, wicked, or at least ruled by wicked kings, idolatrous. The golden calves set up by Jeroboam in the northern tribes are a stumbling block of idolatry for them all the way through. The Baals, instituted by Ahab in terms of a national form of worship, are also a source of stumbling for the northern kingdom. There is a range, there's a spectrum, but for the most part, all of the kings of Israel are wicked. And so the punishment for that is the Assyrian captivity. The nation of Assyria being the superpower there in the, what would that be, the 8th century BC, comes in and takes away most of those people and ships them off to Assyria or to other places. In the south, we have a little bit of a longer dynasty, and it is a dynasty. It is the family of David exclusively, son after son after son, that rules on the throne. People like Hezekiah and Josiah are the high points of the nation of Judah. About half the kings, probably. I haven't done the exact math on that, but it's about 50-50 split between what we call good kings and bad kings. But overall, Judah follows in the same path as their sister to the north. And so as Babylon rises in the 7th century BC to be the regional superpower, God uses them to take the nation of Judah into captivity, into Babylonian exile. And then there will be kind of the last segment of Old Testament history describes the return of some of those Jews, at least, from captivity. But Jeremiah is living and prophesying in this time that is really the end, as the sun is setting on the Davidic dynasty in Judah, and Babylonian captivity is looming. So let's zoom in a little bit on this last part of their history. Remember, Josiah is the last good king. He implements some reforms. He cleans up the temple, literally, and gets them back to worshiping God in the temple as had been prescribed in the law of Moses. But one foolish action at the end of his reign leads to his being killed by Pharaoh Necho, as Pharaoh is headed to the first battle of Carchemish to try to hold off the ascendant Babylonians. So Josiah being no longer, we then have 4 of his descendants that take the throne in successive turns. Jehoahaz is put on the throne but quickly removed by Pharaoh Necho as he returns to Egypt, and Jehoahaz actually goes with Pharaoh, is taken captive to Egypt and doesn't get out again. Instead, Pharaoh puts his brother, Josiah's son, Jehoiakim, on the throne, who will reign for 11 years, as you see here. And during that time period is when Nebuchadnezzar will win the second battle at Carchemish and establish regional dominance and come into, in the year 605, Jerusalem and take the first wave of captives, which includes, if you look at Daniel chapter 1, verse 1, the youths, the most attractive of the upper class in terms of education and intelligence and probably appearance and talent and all that kind of stuff. Daniel and his friends among those that are taken in that first wave of captivity. Jehoiakim is left alone, although it appears that he's kind of a pain to the Babylonians. But he dies a natural death, and his son Jehoiachin takes over the throne in 598, 597. And Nebuchadnezzar, in retaliation probably for Jehoiakim's shenanigans, besieges Jerusalem and takes another wave of captives, which is a much larger section of the population. And Jehoiachin is among them. Jehoiachin's 18 years old when he takes the throne, and 3 months later is taken by Nebuchadnezzar into captivity. And we'll learn more about him tonight. But suffice it to say now that at 18 years old, he is removed immediately from the throne, taken to Babylon, and his uncle, Josiah's son Zedekiah, takes over the throne. And 11 years later, as a result of Zedekiah's rebellion against the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar has had enough, comes in and wipes the place out and takes the rest of the people, including Zedekiah, who he treats rather violently, into Babylonian captivity, leaving only very few people left under the governorship of Gedaliah, which we talked some about in Jeremiah. Okay, so we ran through a bunch of that history very, very quickly. But one last thing to say about this genealogy of sorts here of the kings of Judah. Remember that in all of this mess, from these kings comes the lineage of Christ. Specifically, from Jehoiachin, the son of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, going back all the way up to David. That is where the line will run. Best we can tell, Jehoiachin's grandson is Zerubbabel, who will lead the effort to come back to Judah, rebuild the temple, and he then, as well as Jehoiachin, Jehoiakim, Josiah, so on and so forth, appears in the genealogy of Matthew 1, of which will come eventually Jesus of Nazareth, the Messiah, and the king that was predicted and anticipated all throughout Israel's history. Okay, so that's the historical context, both kind of macro and micro of the book of Jeremiah. Let's talk a little bit about the main themes. I have, again, slimmed this down, and I've just gone with 12 highlighted verses or chapters, as opposed to maybe 20 or 25 that I've had throughout the class. So let's just run through these. And again, the goal is that these phrases, these words, even individual words, phrases, and verses stick with us as marking what are the main ideas and the main themes present in the book of Jeremiah. So chapter 2, God says of the people, they have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewed out for themselves broken cisterns that hold no water. Okay, hopefully you're shouting these out at the TV while you're at home. Okay, so there's a big problem with the people in terms of choosing idols and other nations which cannot help them, like a broken cistern which just leaks out dirty water, and they have passed on the source of life, the fountain of living waters. That's a problem, and it's leading to this dire consequence. But chapter 6, the false prophets say, no, everything's fine, don't worry about it. And so God says of them, they have healed the wound of my people lightly. There we go. I got a response here before I could get it in. Yelled it out. Peace, peace. Everything's fine. They're putting a Band-Aid on a flesh wound, so to speak. There's no peace. And yet these false prophets say, don't worry, everything is okay. 2 verses later, God will say, they are offering you a false hope, peace, peace, when there's no peace. But God does offer something. It's something much more rich, something much more full, something much more permanent. And And it takes a much more serious action, okay, called repentance. Look for the ancient ways, walk in the good way, and you will find rest for your souls. Okay, there is true rest available if you will seek it in Jehovah God. But that is not what the people have chosen. So chapter 7, kind of an epitome of their failure as a people in the temple. Jeremiah says, has this house, which is called by my name, speaking for the Lord, become a den of robbers in your sight? Just because they had the temple, everything was fine. They could go on living immorally and idolatrous and unjustly in the land. God, through Jeremiah, says, not so fast. That's not the way it works. Okay, chapter 17, a couple verses here, speaking of the choice the people have. On one hand, blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord. Okay, trust in God, and you will be like a tree planted by the water. That water imagery comes up again. We've made the connection to Psalm 1, but think about the connection back to chapter 2. The fountain of living water, the tree planted by the water. God is the source of life. Trust in him, and you have stability and peace and security and rest. On the other hand, what most people, most of us, to be fair, choose to do, chapter 17, verse 9, the human heart is more deceitful than all else and is desperately sick. That's what was guiding the people, is their own thoughts, their own opinions, their own feelings, their own impulses. And there's trouble in that, according to Jeremiah. But God has a plan for the future. And so in chapter 23, one of those plans is that he will raise up for David a branch. Yeah, and branch is the messianic term for the king, the Messiah that is coming. I guess that was a little bit redundant, but the messianic term for this king, the son of David that is coming to reestablish his kingdom, and he will reign as king and act wisely to do justice and righteousness, the kind of the duo of what king's responsibility is for the people. Okay, that's the long-term vision. That's the messianic hope. In the meantime, though, there is this looming threat of the Babylonians that God, through Jeremiah, has said it's imminent. It's going to happen, and you can't really do anything to stop it. And so, as a certain prediction, God says that this whole land will be a desolation and a horror, and these nations, remember, it wasn't just Judah, but Ammonites, the Moabites, the Edomites, these nations will serve the king of Babylon for how long? 70 years. Okay, that becomes the big number that comes out of the book of Jeremiah, a number that Daniel will latch onto in Daniel chapter 9 and say, hey, looking at my watch here, it's been 70 years. Man, Daniel was old to see all of that from the beginning of Nebuchadnezzar's reign to 70 years or up. And so he prays for God to act in that moment. Okay, how many did I tell you there was going to be? I guess 4 more things here from our review of Jeremiah. Take this cup of wine. What does the wine represent? The cup represents God's wrath, that all the nations are going to drink it. Remember, so the punishment on Judah is unique because they are God's covenant people, and yet all the nations are subject to God's righteous judgment. But for his people, yes, they are lumped in with the judgment on the nations, but yet God has a plan for them, those that will be his people, those that are loyal to him, those that are faithful to God. He says, I know the plans I have for you, plans for welfare, not for calamity, to give you a future and give you a hope. And remember, this is important. We don't want to take this out of context. It does not mean, like some people maybe suppose it to mean, that God's only ever going to do pleasant things for us or for his people. No, these people are staring down the barrel of 70 years in Babylonian captivity away from their home, and 70 very difficult years. Read Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon, there we wept because we missed our homeland. But in the long term, the long game for God is to provide something good for his people. Short term may very well and probably will be difficult trying to serve God. But in the long term, there is a plan for welfare. There is a hope. And that hope, of course, is bound up in the new covenant that God is preparing to bring through Jesus of Nazareth. And so chapters 30 to 33 are largely about that messianic hope. And so the section begins in chapter 30, verse 3. I will restore the fortunes of my people, Israel and Judah. Things are going to turn around when I do something new. And particularly in chapter 31, the thing that is new is a new covenant that he will make, not like the covenant that he had with their fathers. Okay, that's our review of the historical context and some of the major themes and ideas from Jeremiah. Really the whole thing. I know that was like 31 chapters, but remember the rest of that section of 33 is the hope, and then we had like 11 chapters of historical material, narrative stories about the fall of Jerusalem, and then we had the section on the nations from 46 to 51. And here we are then with the last word, the epilogue of sorts of the book of Jeremiah. What is this? Before we read it together and talk about it, let's talk about what it is. Remember, and I've already alluded to this, chapter 51, verse 64. Remember, concluded, it kind of wrapped up. It said, the words of Jeremiah. There you go. There you have it. Thus far are the words of Jeremiah. And remember, the words of Jeremiah, that phrase was the first phrase of the whole book in chapter 1, verse 1. And so we kind of bookended, and Jeremiah's words are concluded. And yet there's still more material. So it seems like somebody tacked this on. Maybe imagine somebody like Baruch, right? The scribe of Jeremiah, who clearly we saw earlier was responsible for literally writing what Jeremiah had said. Maybe Baruch or somebody like him compiling this account added this epilogue at the end to kind of tie a bow on the collection of messages found in Jeremiah. And what this does is we'll see, is it retells a story that's already been told in the book of Jeremiah. It retells the story of Jerusalem's fall. And more than that, not only did chapter 39 kind of already say what we're going to read in this chapter, at least kind of the basic gist of it, about Jerusalem finally being given over to the Babylonians. But if you go look, and if you're a Bible writer, you could write in there as a reference or flip over right now and just take a glimpse at it. This is going to be almost word for word, verbatim at points, actually large sections of it, largely parallel all the way through to the account that ends the book of 2 Kings. Remember, Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, is a chronicled history of the divided kingdom, or the united in the divided kingdom. And so the end of 2 Kings is the end of the story of what happens to Judah. And you went and read it overlaid with Jeremiah 52, you would find much of the same material included there. Okay. And so the question would be, why is this here? Okay. If we believe in biblical inspiration, which I do, I would believe that we all would believe that this is inspired by the Holy Spirit. These things are put in for a reason, and we can count on them. We can rely on them as being God's word, as being true and factual, obviously. But even in the arrangement, that there's some kind of purpose behind the arrangement of these books. What purpose does this serve? Why is this here? And maybe that's a question you can ask or have in your mind as we go through the chapter. Maybe we can say some things about it as we go. Okay. Let's just jump in, and mostly we'll just read and then highlight a few things again, because a lot of this stuff we've talked about before, and I want to make sure we don't run out of time before I say some things about how this chapter, at least the end of this chapter, I think really is an encouraging thing for us, as discouraging as most of this will sound. Okay, Jeremiah 52, let's just notice the first 11 verses that describes what happens to Zedekiah, which again, you probably remember what happened to him. But chapter 52, verse 1, Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Hamutal, the daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah. Different Jeremiah, of course. Verse 2, he did evil in the sight of the Lord, like all that Jehoiakim had done. For through the anger of the Lord, this came about in Jerusalem and Judah until he cast them out from his presence. And Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. Now it came about in the 9th year of his reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came, he and his army, against Jerusalem, camped against it, built a siege wall around it. Verse 5, so the city was under siege until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. On the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine was so severe in the city that there was no food for the people of the land. Then the city was broken into, and all the men of war fled and went forth from the city at night by way of the gate between the two walls, which was by the king's garden. Though the Chaldeans were all around the city. It's going to be hard to get out. Right? And they went by the way of the Arabah, but the army of the Chaldeans pursued the king and overtook Zedekiah in the plains of Jericho, and all his army was scattered from him. And they captured the king and brought him up to the king of Babylon at Riblah in the land of Hamath, and he passed sentence on him. The king of Babylon slaughtered the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. He also slaughtered all the princes of Judah in Riblah. Verse 11, then he blinded the eyes of Zedekiah, and the king of Babylon bound him with bronze fetters and brought him to Babylon and put him in prison until the day of his death. Okay, again, we've seen all this before. A couple of things that I think are interesting just from the first 4 verses. There is something about this that is very insightful, or at least kind of makes clear something we've talked about before, which is that God had a plan in all of this. God was doing something, okay? Notice verse 3 says, this came about through the anger of the Lord, okay? God had his purposes. His wrath was being revealed, to use the language of Romans 1, against the unrighteousness of Judah. Okay. Now, what's interesting about that, the way this is phrased, there's some question based on what translation you have. It kind of seems to say that Zedekiah's reign itself, being an evil king or a bad king, that was brought about through the anger of the Lord. Right. So how does that work? Well, again, referencing Romans 1, I think it's fitting. Remember what Paul's point is in Romans 1. In Romans 1, how is God revealing his wrath? Is it by sending fire from heaven to consume all these sinners? No, it's by giving them over to their rebellious ways and to the natural consequences of that. Okay? And holding them accountable, of course, for their sin. So you maybe see something similar in what the author is saying here about Judah, that as these kings took over and were more and more wicked and less trusting of God, this is God handing them over, and the natural consequences of their behavior, of their stubbornness, of their wickedness, of their refusal to trust in God, the natural consequence of that is that they would be destroyed. And God was working this out. Through his anger, he was bringing about the fall of Jerusalem as a consequence for their sin. But the end of verse 4 also gives us the kind of the visible side of or angle of what's going on. Remember, the prophets, what they're doing is pulling back the curtain to show what God's up to. But even from what can be seen, there's an explanation for what happened here, which is that Zedekiah rebelled against Babylon. Babylon wouldn't have it, so they come in and bring full force to siege Jerusalem and tear it down to the ground, which is what they do. After, a year and a half, it looks like, of sieging the city, no food left, people are starving. Finally, the wall is broken into, and those mighty soldiers. Remember all those guys in Jeremiah? Remember all these people, these officials that were getting on to Jeremiah and accusing him of treason, right? Because they said, "Well, you're telling people to surrender. You're a traitor." Okay, and yet when the enemy busts through the gates, these soldiers, these mighty men, what do? They turn and run. Okay, talk about cowardly. Zedekiah among them, as we've seen earlier in the book, he runs away as well. He's captured. His sentence is to have his sons killed before his eyes, and then to have his eyes plucked out, or at least to be blinded, so that the last thing he witnesses is his sons and officials being murdered. And then he's taken blind into captivity, and he is put in prison with bronze fetters until he dies. Okay, so that's the fate of Zedekiah, the end of his reign, the consequence of his sin, of course, largely the consequence of Judah's sin and unfaithfulness and Babylon wreaking its havoc upon Jerusalem, and Zedekiah ending his life in captivity. Okay, comments or questions?